Hello, welcome to this presentation on ethical relativism. I'm the instructor for your course, Doug Borcoman. First of all, let's try to define ethical relativism, and in what follows we'll attempt to show the importance of this particular concept to our study of ethics. Ethical relativism holds that there are no universally valid moral principles, but rather that all moral principles are valid relative to culture or individual choice. It's important to focus on the term relative. Essentially what that means is that there are no absolute objective principles according to the doctrine of ethical relativism. As we pursue our studies of ethics, we'll discover, of course, that there is an oppositional point of view and other areas in between. It's not as if ethical relativism is completely at the opposite end of what we call ethical objectivism, which we'll be studying shortly, because there are all sorts of other ethical perspectives and orientations in between those two extremes. But what we attempt to do is to try to set up a kind of a dichotomy in order to express and explain what the various postures and positions are from a somewhat ideal point of view. Again, the term relative, that essentially means that if one culture, culture A, has a set of moral principles, and another culture, culture B, has a set of moral principles that may be somewhat different from that of culture A, then we have a situation in which we cannot really say that one is quote-unquote better than the other. And in roughly the same way, when you talk about the individual, it could be that an extreme form of ethical relativism is manifested in the view that each individual has his or her own choice of moral precepts, and no one can judge between the two. In addition to relativism is the concept of moral skepticism, which sometimes tends to lead to a kind of relativism. And this is a view that there are no valid moral principles at all. So essentially, we've got a situation in which relativism suggests that moral principles and perspectives are valid with respect to a specific culture or region or society. Skepticism says it's not possible at all. A person that kind of stands out with respect to that kind of skepticism, and of course he's certainly a nihilist, the kind of skepticism that leads to nihilism, we'll discuss him briefly shortly, is Friedrich Nietzsche. And of course the other aspect of moral skepticism is a more epistemological claim, and that is to say that we cannot know whether there are any moral principles. Extreme skepticism, we find this in some of the early Greek philosophers, and we will cover that to some extent in more detail later. In contrast, it's important to point out that another view called moral objectivism is entirely distinct from relativism, but nevertheless it allows us to be able to put in context what the relativist is actually asserting. And this is not, by the way, an entirely quote-unquote academic undertaking to discuss these things. I think you'll notice that if you master the vocabulary and get the idea in your mind, that you probably are able to identify, without over-categorizing them, other people who also represent moral objectivism or moral relativism. I think you can probably try to apply some of these terms to people that you interface with in your daily activities. Moral objectivism is a view that there are universal moral principles valid for all people in all situations and times. We'll discuss that, as stated previously, in a little bit more detail. And the picture that I've included here, and I'll try to reference those pictures that I've included, that I believe people who specifically represent the moral posture that we happen to be talking about. This is Mr. Immanuel Kant, a philosopher who is known for, among other things, a groundbreaking work called A Critique of Pure Reason. Also in contrast with relativism is the idea of absolutism. And if you just take a look at the meaning of the term, I'm sure that you realize that absolutism implies something distinct from relativism. It is the notion that there is only one correct answer to every moral problem. And what we call a completely absolutistic ethic suggests that absolute principles provide an answer for every possible situation in life, regardless of culture. And of course, it is opposed entirely to ethical relativism. The reason we talk about contrasting positions, some of which are indeed perceived to be opposite, is because the contrast allows us to better express the essential character of the position in question. You're getting that annoying little pop-up that is due to a sort of conflict apparently between Windows 7 on the one hand and the Camtasia that I'm using at this time. So it may pop up again in the future. There's also the notion of ethical nihilism, and I think that that doctrine probably is best conveyed from the point of view of the Batman movie, where you have the Joker, and also up here you have the philosopher, 19th century philosopher, principally Friedrich Nietzsche, who was probably a neoclassical nihilist. This is a doctrine that holds that there are no valid moral principles that exist at all. Probably seems a little bit like skepticism, but it just simply makes a positive assertion about something that's very negative. Ethical nihilism, and the term nihil, by the way, literally means nothing. Nihil, there's a nothingness about our morality, and in fact it's all made up. Perhaps a figure like the Joker in Batman, The Dark Knight, is a good example that you can relate to. If you saw the movie, you would know that this particular figure was kind of a caricature of sorts, highly intelligent, in some respects highly rational, apparently completely devoid of any moral commitment whatsoever, and probably at that level he's best characterized, at least prima facie, as an ethical nihilist. So I hope that you're able to kind of grasp what nihilism would involve. If you think of a figure like the Joker, I admit, certainly it's a part that a person is playing or portraying or acting, but you can derive a significant amount of benefit from that. My recollection of that movie, which I enjoyed thoroughly, of course, it has a lot of moral attributes that we could discuss and will discuss as time progresses. This Joker type, in contrast with Batman, who has his own set of moral issues, by the way, seems to be completely immune to any standards that might be advanced by society, any society. Doesn't matter. If you talk about relativism, well, it doesn't matter to the Joker apparently what culture or society he's in. He has his own standards, if he has them at all, and actually seem to make them up as he goes along. You can find that, it seems to me, in terms of the movie, with respect to some of the episodic events with respect to his colleagues, whom he's willing to stab in the back just as much as he's willing to try to take on the police and the community at large. So seems to be a person almost entirely without ethics. Ethically neutral is another possibility. I think that if you could talk to the Joker, he'd probably say that there's no such thing as moral principles, but admittedly he does have a certain standard, I suppose you might say, which he applies to his relationship to what would appear on the face of it to be his opposite, Batman. Another example of what a nihilist might say. You've got these two characters, one of whom is wanting to ban the bomb, the other whom is wanting to save the whale, and the other of whom has absolutely nothing on his t-shirt. He's like what we call a moral tabula rasa. He's a nihilist, and therefore has nothing to say at all about either of those two subjects. I'm paralleling your book here, and in an attempt to try to explain a little bit more detail, something that you may have been picking up already, and that is the notion of the diversity thesis. This is not a moral theory per se. It's not an ethical or philosophical theory. It's an anthropological theory, if one may differentiate between anthropology and philosophy. And it states essentially that moral rules differ from society to society. Simple. It means, from a descriptive ethics point of view, that we have made an observation that there are different moral rules in different societies. And of course it's associated with what we call cultural relativism, and I'm sure that at some point in time you have read about or heard of the great anthropological essayist and theorist, Miss Ruth Benedict, who is pictured here. The dependency thesis is a little bit different. It states essentially that individual acts are right or wrong depending on the nature of the society in which they occur. and that morality doesn't just come out of the universe as a natural rightist theory, by analogy might suggest natural rights occur, or knowledge occurs. And the dependency thesis suggests that morality must be seen in a context that depends upon the wants, the goals, the beliefs, the history and environment of society. So the dependency thesis says that really your moral comportment depends upon how you were raised, what the traditions are, what the history is of the culture, region, or society in which you lived. Another term that's very closely related to relativism is subjectivism, sometimes known as subjective ethical relativism. There's a version of subjectivism that has to do with knowledge gaining called epistemological subjectivism. But its assertion is simply that morality depends not on society, but rather on the individual. You kind of make it up as you go along. Now, in the 70s, and some of you might remember some historical remnants of that, either having read about it or experienced it directly yourself, the idea that just about anything goes, do what you feel, etc., is a form of moral subjectivism. And it is compared, according to subjectivists, more to simply having a taste for something or a judgment. So a movie is good, for example, because you like it. Now, the objectivist might say a movie is good because it fits certain criteria which have been agreed upon, which is a totally different way of evaluating a movie. You can like a bad movie in some respect and dislike what would be aesthetically a good movie. So some again would argue that that your sense of what a good movie is or a bad movie is, while not necessarily in and of itself a moral concern, is different from what the objective criteria of would be for what it takes to be a good movie. And those have been laid down, by the way, by movie theorists. And so it can be seen that morality is analogous to that, or the discussion of morality, insofar as many objectivists or people who are trying to hold that morality actually means something more than just simply what your sentiment might be. They will say that morality has a set of criteria. Now, we may disagree on the criteria, but nevertheless, there are a set of criteria, and it's not simply a matter of taste. That would be the objection to what we call subjectivism here. Or preference, even. And of course, going one step further, some would argue on the subjectivist vein that morality is in the eye of the beholder. It's just what you think it is. The problem, again, we'll discuss at some length future moments in our course. But think of what it really means. Is you probably have heard somewhere the notion that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Very subjective. Morality is in the eye of the beholder. What this essentially means is that we can all have our own different moral codes of conduct. And again, the problem that could arise would be when your sense of morality is significantly different than somebody else's, and you're attempting to try to navigate through a set of problems and conflicts that might arise. How do you decide them if, in fact, it is a foregone conclusion that it's all up to you to decide? Very difficult issue. Conventionalism is probably the moral perspective that most of us find ourselves involved in, willingly or not. And this is a view that states that there are no objective moral principles, but that all valid moral principles are justified by virtue of their cultural acceptance. So it emphasizes the social nature of morality, meaning, in essence, if we have conventionally agreed that we're going to uphold and abide by certain moral precepts, then, of course, it turns out that in order to be a part of the culture that enforces those or promotes those ideas, we have to conventionally go along with the program. The ultimate critique of ethical relativism is that, on the one hand, when you look around, it just looks as though different cultures do indeed have different moral precepts and different moral values. And that appears to be a factual sort of situation. But it doesn't necessarily follow that ethical relativism is true. In other words, the point that's being made here is that just because we have a bunch of different moral codes of conduct, which we can obviously observe, particularly in a sociological or anthropological context, it doesn't follow that none of them are quote-unquote better than the others or truer. I know it's a hard thing to grasp because I suspect that we tend to live in a kind of a conventionalistic, even relativistic culture, either in our nation, the United States, or perhaps even globally now. But at the same time, I suppose you have to ask yourself the question, what would it be like if you could never challenge somebody's moral position for any reason whatsoever, and you just simply had to go along with it when you knew, or thought you knew, that either A, you sensed that something was gravely wrong with the moral posture of another person in another culture, or B, you had some good reason for thinking that a specific position or principle should be changed, abolished, or at least reviewed. It's hard to do that if you're a full-fledged relativist. Beliefs, history, and environment change in any society over time, of course. And so what that can mean is that on the one hand, we do have some changing mores and codes of conduct. On the other, it doesn't necessarily follow that there's nothing that is ultimately universal. If moral principles are weakly dependent, does that make them invalid? So what that is sort of saying is that if you have a moral principle that is somehow dependent entirely upon a context associated with a culture or region, does it follow that it necessarily does not have objective, and I mean that in a logical, critical thinking sense, grounding? And we'll see later on the contrast between objectivism on the one hand and what we're talking about right now, ethical relativism. The issue about indeterminacy of translation also, of course, has to do to some extent what we talk about when we talk about language translation. We might discover ultimately that what on a face, as we say, prima facie, on a face of it, what we see is a different kind of moral code of conduct in one culture, at the depth level is not that different at all. There do seem to be what we call, even cultural relativists seem to acknowledge it, taboos, universal taboos. Amongst them being the classic Oedipus Rex type taboo against marrying your mother. There's another, generally speaking, it doesn't necessarily hold in all cases, but about marrying a sibling, a brother or sister, having intercourse, sexual intercourse with people that are in your own family, those kinds of things, seem to be some universal taboos. This is not to say that every single culture practices them, but we discover that most do, and most seem to have a problem with murder as well. And we'll discuss that at some greater length. Think of the definition of murder, for example. If it were up to a relativist, it would simply be subjected to the culture that you were involved with. But by definition, murder means something like the killing of an innocent human being. Mere killing is one thing, but murder is a specific kind of killing. You have to practically evaluate what you would give up in your life if you adopted the view, in terms of your own moral safety, so to speak, if you adopted the view that, from the point of view of ethical relativism, that every cultural pronouncement on murder is as good as any other. So think about that. Thank you very much for joining me. And now, what we're going to show is a brief video of a gentleman who conducted a website called No Dogs or Philosophers Allowed. Very funny little title. I believe he's now passed away, but before he passed, about 10 years ago, did a series of videos. I'm going to include it here in this presentation because I think it's going to be interesting for you to just take a look at, and I think he does a very good job in an impromptu way of showing the distinctions between relativism and objectivism.
There is a battle going on in our culture, and it may be going on in your mind as well. For want of better terms, let's call the belligerents the absolutists and the relativists. And what's at stake are our assumptions about the universe we live in, and the questions, the basic human questions we ask ourselves. What is real? What is true? What is good for us to do? One human response has been that of the absolutists. And theirs is to seek out some non-human, timeless foundation for our webs of belief. An abiding source for answers about how things are and how they should be. Absolutists believe that we can tell the difference between truth, that is, real knowledge about real stuff, and mere opinion. And they also believe there are special methods for us to get the one true version of how things are. And then once we have that, we have a guide for how we can live. Now, if this all seems both comforting and obvious, well, it should. After all, this approach has been at the center of Western philosophical and religious thinking for as far back as you want to go. But it's not the only way people are thinking today. Now, opposing this army of objectivity seekers, we find another faction of thinker, the relativists. They don't buy into any idea of some neutral, fundamental version of events that we can all get our hands on. Rather, they believe that all values emerge from the activities of human communities, the communities that you and I were born into and live our lives out in. For the relativists, for the pragmatists, the test of truth is whether a statement works for us right now. And, hey, you can always get a better version of events later. For the relativist, there is no God's eye view, just human communities muddling through. Yeah, there is bad blood between these two groups, no doubt about that. The absolutist gang is all over the relativists these days, accusing them of somehow contributing to the moral decay of our society. And the relativists, they scoff at this, and they say, look, there's no way you could ever have gotten a hold of real essences to things anyway. And why build some grand metaphysical structure merely to confirm what is the natural, ongoing attempt to find a better way to live with each other? What is at stake here?